Hey, so you know how they say the only one you should compete against is yourself? Initially, I thought, oh great, finally I have someone to have a water gun battle with. But not so fun, just turned into a long stakeout. Turns out a bit of context is needed, such as the old you versus the new you. The old me ain't winning that one, but how about this for a battle? The old Nintendo versus the new Nintendo. Which immediately some of you might be thinking, has Nintendo really even changed that much? And there's certainly something to that. Nintendo wouldn't have earned its reputation for being weird without holding on to some things from the past, something we all might be able to relate to. When it comes to the old Nintendo, there's typically two main things people think of. Number one, their iconic video game consoles and video games, the most obvious thing, but also their business practices, often considered to be unethical, shady, not very nice. Nintendo were thought to be dirty dogs, is what I'm trying to say. You see, back then, Nintendo were the top dogs, at least in North America, and with that came a lot of money to potentially be made by all parties involved. And you know how that goes. Where there's money, there's people getting mad. When it came to the Nintendo Entertainment System specifically, because it was such a hot seller, retailers would often be concerned about getting enough product in stock, which Nintendo would be intentionally restrictive about in some cases, no doubt why they get accused of doing the same thing nowadays. You also had publishers who became frustrated with Nintendo for limiting their ability to generate profits, most famously the only 5 games per year rule, where publishers could only publish 5 games each year for Nintendo's console. Perhaps Nintendo overreacted to the free-for-all the game industry was before that led to the infamous crash in 1983 that caused them to be over-controlling. But for this video, I don't want to get into how dirty or not dirty of dogs Nintendo were. The point is simply that they had a reputation for it, at least among some of those they did business with. When it came to the average consumer back then, they were far less likely to be complaining, at least certainly compared to nowadays, where voicing your problems with Nintendo is darn near trendy, something you can really hang your hat on. Now, maybe this is because the average consumer is more privy to Nintendo's business decisions in modern times, or perhaps it's due to the internet having made it easier to voice negative opinions to strangers. It's just not the same in person. I wanted to complain about having a hard time finding the Banjo-Kazooie amiibo at my local Target to someone walking down my sidewalk, but they just kept on walking. But don't you worry, they didn't get off so easy. But that was a lot of work. If you want to up the efficiency of your complaining to strangers game, you do this. Now we're cooking with gas. But when it comes to people who played Nintendo back in the day, the outlook tends to be more positive than those who were doing business with them. I mean, their relationship with Nintendo was mostly just playing the games they released, not fighting them in court over who had the rights to publish Tetris, which I think we can all agree, not as fun as actually playing Tetris. I heard that. Come on now, you Tetris haters. For those who love video games, a lot of folks will tell you that Nintendo is the foundation of their love for video games, especially if they're roughly my age or older. And how old am I? I promise I don't even know anymore. Could have sworn I was a kid when Mario Kart 8 first came out, but for many gamers, the Nintendo Entertainment System is where it all started for them. Although it should be pointed out that while it was a big hit in the United States, it wasn't quite as popular in other parts of the world, but still considered to be a big success overall. And while nowadays, sure, it can warm an old geezer like myself's heart to know that a large chunk of a new generation has something like the Switch to serve as their foundation for a love of video games, it's certainly not the same old Nintendo. It's a new Nintendo. For For starters, being a fan of Nintendo isn't as synonymous with loving video games as it once was. Quick little story for you. So somebody says to me, yeah, my friend's kids play video games. To which I say, oh nice, which system do they play? And the answer was iPad. So yeah, things have changed quite a bit. Back in the late 80s or early 90s, in the United States at least, if you played video games, good chance you either played Nintendo or made a very conscious choice not to play it, aka chose to play Sega. You didn't have PlayStation or Xbox as other possible choices, although I suppose you could say that some kids nowadays don't have a choice either. That is, in scenarios where mommy and or daddy are gamers and have decided Nintendo consoles it is. Hey, they say parenting is the hardest job there is, but certain parts of the job are easier to get behind than others. When talking about the games and hardware itself, Nintendo's older consoles used to be a lot more straightforward. And while sure, the cartridge insertion mechanism for the NES might seem like madness today, that wasn't the original design in Japan and was more so just a way for retailers in the US to feel like they were selling a toy and not a video game console, since, you know, video games had a bad rap at the time due to the video game crash in 1983. And while sure, the NES had stuff like Rob the Robot and Duck Hunt with the Zapper that came out in its initial stages, that seemed to be more so part of the plan to market as a toy initially, as the system quickly hunkered down and really focused on more traditional, straightforward games, many of which are considered all-time classics to this day. Certainly, by the time the Super Nintendo came out, there was very little you could call gimmicky, so long as you're not talking to haters of the color purple or the eject button, which I'll never understand. I like the eject button. I mean, come on, the eject button deserves a t-shirt made for it if the GameCube C-Stick gets one. Ironically, the Super Nintendo, perhaps the least gimmicky console to come from Nintendo, a company known for their gimmicks, is also one of the more popular choices people have for their favorite Nintendo console, or heck, just favorite console, period. The Nintendo 64 was thought to be a weird console for using cartridges, but not in a trying to do something new and different weird kind of way, but rather in a, oh, you haven't updated your phone in 6 years weird kind of way. Hey, this thing can still do everything it needs to do. But yeah, the N64 stuck with cartridges at a time everything else was moving to CDs, and you want to talk about a step backwards, it doesn't even have an eject button to pop the cartridge up. Now, if you really want to get weird with the Nintendo 64, all you gotta do is bust out this Pied Piper, a classic example of Nintendo trying to do something different that some people hated while others really hated it, and of course some people did indeed love. But as unique as this controller was, I don't think it was until the Nintendo Wii, what I personally think of as the cutoff point between old and new Nintendo. I expect some will disagree, but that was when I feel Nintendo developed a reputation for being a company that was really willing to take a big swing on hardware that tried to be different, which sometimes would be a swing and a hit, or sometimes a swing and a miss. Even when you look at their handheld line of consoles, you'll notice a trend where most of their handhelds were pretty straightforward, aka a plastic slab with buttons and a screen on it, that all sold well, by the way, until the DS. This is actually a 3DS I have here, but the DS had 2 screens and touch controls, easily a very noticeable departure from the Game Boy line. And yep, the DS was Nintendo's concurrent handheld during most of the Wii's lifespan, launching about 2 years prior. When looking at games by Nintendo, the big difference to me is that the old Nintendo was the company that was inventing some of its biggest franchises, most of which have been kept alive to at least some degree, some not as well as others. Naturally, it has been the job of new Nintendo to try to evolve some of its most popular franchises. In fact, as far as games go, that's pretty much what they are now. A company looking for new ways to release games that are a part of long-standing franchises. Think about it. How many big new franchises have they released in the last 20 years? There's Splatoon, love me some Splatoon, but not much besides that. They've got their hands full with a bunch of franchises as it is. Well-loved franchises, ones that fans have been banging down doors for sequels to. The old Nintendo was the company giving birth to a lot of these franchises, and because the development cycle for most games wasn't nearly as long as it is nowadays, they could really crank them out, releasing games far more frequently than today. There are older gamers and gamers with health complications who are legitimately concerned over whether they'll live to see the day Metroid Prime 4 comes out. This stuff matters. Now, could the new Nintendo focus a little bit less on Mario so that other franchises get more love? Absolutely, but Mario is really popular, and if people keep buying the bejesus out of it, Nintendo is going to continue to release games. There's an element of giving the people what they want. Why do you think I flash my bread bag clip collection so often? Sure, it's boastful, but it gets everyone excited. Alright, but that's about it for my thoughts. Of course, there's always so much more that could be said about Nintendo, some of which I've already talked about in older videos, and some of which I will talk about in future videos. But having said that, I would be curious what you all prefer between old and new Nintendo, which, since this is a channel focused on retro gaming, I'd guess most will say they prefer the old Nintendo. It's like they always say, out with the new and in with the old. But with that, leave your thoughts down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's